Welcome back everyone. In today's video I'm going to talk about riving knives. In particular, I'm going to talk about my riving knife and why it's not in my table saw. First of all, I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about riving knives and why we have them in the first place. Table saw manufacturers did not used to put them in table saws. They eventually ended up in every table saw as a standard safety feature. What the purpose of the riving knife is that as you're making a rip cut, it keeps the kerf open. As the wood is passing through the blade, the kerf does not close up on the end that's already cut. That prevents it from jamming up and causing kickback on you. It's supposed to also prevent the board from getting sucked into the blade and shooting back at you, kind of like a slingshot effect. Hopefully you're using a push stick or push blocks, so you're not going to end up with your hands in that position ever. That, in a nutshell, is what the riving knife is meant to do. As I said, all manufacturers, even the manufacturers that are producing very cheap table saws, are including a riving knife when they ship their table saw. Now, your table saw has the riving knife usually installed already when it leaves the factory. There will also be manufacturer specifications on the type of blade you should always be using with your table saw. In my case, I own a heavy-duty job site table saw made by Ridgid. What came standard on my table saw when I bought it about 11 years ago was this Ridgid blade, which, yes, I still have the original blade. I took it off on day one because it's a terrible blade. Of course, the riving knife was already installed, and all the other safety features, the kickback claws and the blade guard, could be mounted onto the riving knife at the front of the table saw. Now, these two things that I'm holding in my hands left the factory as you see them, and they are meant to work together. Now, if you switch the blade to something like this Diablo blade that I bought, this is a 90 TPI Diablo blade that I swapped out the Ridgid blade for on day one. There's several blades down the road, but this is the 10-inch blade that I've last used on my table saw. That gave me much better results than the factory Ridgid blade. Now for this, I'm going to use metric. I'm just going to take my calipers here and I'm going to put it down on the thickest part of the blade, which is the top of the tooth, and that gives me 2.29 millimeters. Based on what I have on my calipers. Now for the riving knife. That's 2.26 millimeters. Now the Diablo blade. Now how does that compare with the 7 1/4 inch blade that I currently have in my table saw? Like this one. We have 1.37 millimeters for the 7 1/4 inch. The calipers aside, I'm going to take my riving knife and put it right up against the blade. This is the factory blade. The riving knife is only slightly thinner than the blade itself. That's what you want. You want a riving knife that is thinner than the blade that you are using. We're going to see that the riving knife now is actually a little thicker than the blade. Just by putting a ruler on top of this, there's about a millimeter of space between the riving knife and the blade. That is not what you want. If I take the framing blade, now put the riving knife up against that, it is very easy to see that the framing blade is almost half as thick as the riving knife. So when I put a ruler on top of that, there's quite a gap there. That's the kerf from my 7 1/4 inch blade. That's what I currently have in my table saw. I'm gonna remove this. will be the 10-inch Diablo. Don't over tighten these. Alright, so this is our factory test. This is our third cut. "10-inch factory blade." That's the Ridgid blade. Alright, let's look at this straight on. I've got all three Kerf samples now from all three blades. I've got the 7 1/4 inch blade, that's the fine cut plywood blade that I've got. I've got the 10-inch Diablo, which is a finer cut than the factory blade, and of course the factory blade, the 10-inch factory blade, which is the widest Kerf. We've got a riving knife, and that just glides really nicely, as you can see, nice and easy with the factory Kerf. The Diablo 10-inch blade, now we've got a little more friction. Kerf's not as wide, and as I go deeper, I'm getting quite a bit of friction. So the longer the cut, the more the friction. This is going to cause some binding, and it's going to cause some problems. So you can see the difference already, and even more so with the 7 1/4 inch. I really have to force this. In fact, the riving knife only gets about halfway and it completely gets stuck. Very, very bad. You do not want this. Using the riving knife with a 7 1/4 inch blade is an absolute no-go. Using it with a 10-inch Diablo blade, not a good idea, because now it's no longer doing what it's designed to do. Using it with the factory blade or a blade of equivalent thickness to create the same kerf is a much better way to go if you're using your riving knife. As the kerf test proves, the riving knife will only really work with a blade that is the factory blade or a blade of equivalent thickness. In my experience, when I switched to a 10-inch Diablo blade, I started having problems with binding, and I actually did get a little bit of kickback because the kerf would jam up on the riving knife. And for the longest time, I couldn't figure out why that was happening. I thought, wow, my riving knife should be keeping me safe. Why is this happening? Why am I getting binding and kickback? Now that's just my experience with my saw. You might have a completely different experience with a different manufacturer. That's something you should be looking at when you're shopping around for a table saw. You really can get into some pretty serious problems when it starts to catch and bind, and then the riving knife ends up doing the opposite of what it's designed to do. The riving knife really has nothing to do with me switching to a 7 1/4 inch blade. There are other reasons why I did that. I've got a video in the description below. You can check that out. Using the 7 1/4 inch obviously gives me the finest kerf and produces the least amount of dust. For me personally, switching to the 7 1/4 inch was the right move. I actually feel a little safer on my table saw with that blade, but again, that's a personal choice. When you shop around for a table saw, don't forget to check the riving knife on each manufacturer. Make sure that it's going to give you the flexibility down the road so that you can switch out different blades. If the riving knife is too thick, you're going to end up having to always choose a thicker blade. Riving knives can be very effective as safety features. They can prevent kickback, and I highly recommend using one on your table saw if you can. Each and every woodworker needs to take responsibility for their own safety, and you have to do what you think is right based on your own experience and the tools that you purchased. I want to let you know that there are new t-shirt designs in my t-shirt shop. You'll see the drawer down below for Teespring. That is where you can purchase the new designs. You'll see me wearing a couple of these myself. I really like them. I'm sure you'll love them too. They're high quality t-shirts. Show your friends how proud you are to have your wood shop up and running. Show the world how proud you are of making your own jigs and tools. If you want to donate to this channel, head on over to my donation page right over here. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. There are a couple more videos on this side you can watch. Until next time, thanks for watching and have a great day.